So yeah, I'm going to talk to you in relation to articulated mobile cranes in the context of the scheme, the federal safety scheme, for those of you that are accredited or seeking accreditation. So I'll be just touching on some of the criteria that are applicable, and obviously some of the common issues that we find as auditors, and some of the tips for you to ensure your systems address. So just as David mentioned previously, 47 workers were killed in Australia between 2003 and 2015. Generally mobile cranes, not specific to articulated mobile cranes. And similarly, some of the stats there that underline the risks for mobile cranes. So 240 serious injury claims per year in Australia. From the US, a bit of an older study going back 15 years or so, 45% of mobile crane incidents involve a rollover, and one mobile crane tips over every 10,000 hours of its use. Obviously, we've talked a lot about overturn, given the issues with articulated cranes, but that's not the only risk. Obviously, there are a number of others. There's collision risk, issues with the jib collapsing, obviously overhead wire contact and electrocution, risks in relation to the load, movement, and obviously people being struck by the load. We'll talk about those a bit more. From an OFSC perspective, as with all the other criteria and the approach from the OFSCs, it's about a management systems approach. As with all criteria, there's an expectation that procedures are documented and that there's implementation taking place. So I've pulled out some of the key system level criteria on the screen there. Obviously, HIRAC is the backbone of a lot of activities on site because it's all about managing risk. Obviously, making sure that your risk management procedures pick up risks involving cranes, particularly pick and carry cranes and articulated cranes, so that, for instance, your project risk register has that identified as a risk, and that then connects with and links to safe work method statements and other processes that you might have in place, like permits to work and so on and so forth. Another key criteria that I identified that's important in this particular context, obviously, is selection of subcontractors and ensuring that you apply a risk-based approach to awarding work to and engaging with crane contractors. And then obviously providing them information about what your expectations are from your safety plan, your risk register, ensuring they're inducted properly, ensuring they provide your safe work method statements, you review and accept them. And then obviously the other key one has obviously come out through this presentation so far is in relation to training. So training of the crane crew in particular, but also training of your own people so that they understand the risks. And obviously this forum today is helping with that. As well as the system level criteria, obviously there are the hazard specific criteria. Obviously mobile plant is the key one, but and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. I thought worthwhile mentioning as well specifically, and there's an opportunity for a future forum in this one, I think, in relation to precast and tilt-up concrete specifically, but obviously in the use of articulated cranes. One thing that quite often occurs is companies don't appreciate that when a Franna crane is being used in a tailing capacity, so it's assisting the main crane lift the concrete panels, that's classed as a dual lift and should be managed accordingly. And obviously all those deration measures are taking place and the proper planning occurs, and that the lift plans show the sharing of the load, etc. Like I said, there's opportunity for a future forum there. As with all of the hazard criteria, the first criteria relates to HIRAC, obviously risk management, and particularly the implementation of the hierarchy of control. So what we expect to see is that your system is able to demonstrate how you do that. So obviously your project risk register should be able to demonstrate the risks involving pick and carry cranes, articulated cranes, and you're able to demonstrate how the hierarchy of control is applied. This may well involve using a different type of crane method rather than an articulated crane. A number of companies I'm aware of have banned the use of Frannas and require alternative methods. That's not something it has to happen, but obviously from a hierarchy control perspective, substitution with another method may well be the most appropriate for you to ensure gets implemented on site. Moving on to the next key one, obviously plant risk assessments, H16.2. The intention of plant risk assessments is to identify the inherent hazards presented by an item of plant and ensure that there are safety features that apply an engineering control where applicable to those hazards, rather than relying on workers doing the right thing. So plant risk assessments, quite often one of the things that we find it's a common cause of problem of cars in audits is because plant risk assessments are not done properly, and companies don't really review and accept them and check that they're doing the right thing. So one of the things that you need to have in place is obviously make sure that you are checking supplied plant risk assessments and making sure that the ones that you're getting are relevant to the specific machines, not copied and pasted, that they identify things like the safety features that are specific to the crane that you're getting on site. Things like those load warning lights that Tom mentioned, whether there's counterweight handrails to protect risk of falls, those kind of things. That's the intention of the plant risk assessment. You need to be ensuring that what you get is relevant to the specific machine. Another common cause of problems for companies is H16.3, which requires safe systems of work for the operation of items in mobile plant. So obviously specific to cranes. There's a number of different ways that you can do this. This is ensuring that the outcomes of the plant risk assessment, site-specific issues, operators' manuals, etc., get distilled into a safe system of work that the crane operator understands and is aware of and is familiar with. So like I said, there's a number of different ways that this can happen. Some companies use safe work method statements, some use standard operating procedures. The crew safe that Brandon mentioned is a good way to be able to demonstrate this, provided that you're able to pick up the site-specific issues as part of that process. And things to look for, like Tom mentioned, tyre pressure, side slopes, gradients, those kind of things need to be clearly understood by the operators specific to the machine. As previously mentioned, overhead wires and services is often a cause of cars being issued. And companies aren't really picking up the minimum controls for working around, adjacent to overhead services. So there's obviously a need to ensure that you're identifying them, identifying what the voltages are, and making sure that your minimum requirements are clearly documented. And again, not relying on lower order controls like spotters and signage when there's opportunities to put in place exclusion zones, and if possible, relocate those overhead services as a first option. And again, potentially, substituting different types of cranes that don't have the ability to enter into those safe approach distances. Obviously, H16.5 is specific to mobile cranes. The first bullet point, ground conditions, is one that is obviously critical in relation to articulated mobile cranes from what's been presented, as is lift planning. This criteria is often one that is not done well. Companies quite often have systems in place that pick up the heavy lifting triggers for when heavy lifts need these extra. So they get geotech reports done for outrigger placement and have third-party reviews for lift plans, those kind of things, and have specific hold points on lift plans for the heavy lifts. However, you need to make sure that your system of work picks up the same requirements when in relation to articulated mobile cranes. It's not only about the size of the load that's been lifted, it's about the risks involved. So making sure that you've got hold points and you've got checks and balances to ensure lift plans do pick up those things that have been explained today previously. A final point, obviously, lifting of workers using articulated cranes should not be taking place. Work boxes not approved for lifting with Franna type cranes. H16.6 inspection and maintenance program, as David mentioned, this is quite often a cause for a number of cars getting issued. Just being clear on what your expectations are and ensuring that the crane crew, crane company provide you with a register. Make sure your system articulates how you need to manage that, whether you incorporate that into your registers or whether you are accepting of theirs, provided that you check that it does what it needs to do and meets your minimum standards. Make sure that the inspection and testing requirements of the lifting and rigging gear is documented in your system, and that they are, any suppliers of that type of equipment are meeting your requirements. A lot of companies now use the RGBY system just for ease of understanding on site, because obviously different rigging and lifting gear has different frequencies. But if you go with the RGBY, it's basically you just look for the color coding and make sure that gear has been inspected within that window. It's easier to understand for the site guys. Not mandatory, but obviously that's a good way to get some ease of understanding across your projects. The next one, H16.7, obviously a key one. This is obviously applicable to all mobile plant, but obviously this applies to cranes as well, and pick and carry cranes, and ensuring that you have controls in place to ensure movement of plant and vehicles on site is managed. Obviously, things like a vehicle movement plan needs to be in place to be clear about what the minimum controls are and not just be general. So just a flow diagram in and out is not adequate. We're looking for things like minimum controls to barrier locations, no-go areas under overhead wires, soft ground, those side slope gradient areas. They all need to be considered and included in your VMP. And also consider the risks, not just the flow around the site, but to workers working with the plant. I noticed on the video that Brandon showed earlier that the Franna in question there had the load tied back to the crane with two taglines. thereby eliminating the risk of the dogger having to walk with that load, which is a great solution. Eliminate the risk to that worker there. So, but don't just consider the dogman. Obviously, other workers and the public need to be factored in that movement of plant control plan. H16.8, as has been mentioned, operators of articulated cranes, obviously there's a licensing requirement, the non-slewing crane as a minimum, but obviously also there's an expectation that people understand how to operate the specific cranes and types of models. And again, the crew safe approach is a really good one. It's from an OFSC perspective, the minimum though is just a license at this stage. So yeah, from your system perspective, it's ensuring that you clearly state the minimum licensing requirements for such types of crane. Another common issue, which quite often comes up, is in relation to the regulatory inspections under the H16.9 inspection programme. Quite often companies don't have the specific checks and balances when they're onboarding a crane to their projects to look for regulatory annual inspections and annual registrations. So for those states that need them, and also quite often find issues in relation to major inspections and whether cranes that are over 10 years have had those and whether they are sufficient. It's good to see that quite often, more often than not now, crane safe is being required for a lot of the principal contractors. There's still a bit of work to do, I think, in terms of the majors and ensuring that you've got the checks and balances to ensure that those major inspections are getting done as part of the minimum requirements getting sent through prior to as part of the crane onboarding process. It's worthwhile mentioning as well, the crane companies, obviously the specialist crane companies do really well more often than not do really well in terms of their meeting the manufacturer's inspection requirements and ongoing maintenance. They're professionals. It's in their business to make sure their pieces of kit are maintained properly. They have close relationships with with the likes of Terex and people like that. We quite often find issues when companies, building companies or construction companies have bought their own franners as a way of minimising cost. They're quite often issues come to light then in relation to the manufacturer's inspections and ongoing maintenance and those major inspections because they don't have the same kind of relationship or linkages with the crane manufacturing companies. So that's something to be aware of if you're one of those companies. The final criteria relates to emergencies and making sure you've got the minimum, scenarios that could eventuate through the use of mobile plants specifically, but obviously in relation to articulated cranes, rollover, as we've talked significantly about in this presentation, but other emergency scenarios. Obviously, we talked about overhead wire contact, but also things like striking scaffolds, striking formwork systems. That your emergency plans need to ensure you pick those up. In summing up, so just to wrap it up, the expectation is that your system identifies in it the minimum requirements that you as a principal contractor are going to be passing on to or making sure that your crane suppliers need to adhere to. They are a PCBU, as are you. They are the specialists, but you just need to make sure that they're consistent and that they're meeting their obligations and providing you with the right paperwork. So obviously good sources of information, as you've seen, SICA. Brandon is a good, what they put out is really good. As are the regulators. There's some good guidance notes. The manufacturers themselves are a good source of information, and some future developments. Brandon's already touched, I think, a little bit on the licensing, but we might talk some more about that in a little bit. But there's also, in due course, I think there's a Queensland Workplace Health and Safety putting out a new mobile crane code very shortly, which obviously for those companies based in or operating in Queensland, you're going to have to pick that up in your system and make sure you adhere to that. Obviously, that's quite often when one leads, the other states follow quite often, and so keep an eye on that. For those of you that aren't based or operating in Queensland, it's worth having a look at just to see what information there is in there. So.